You may have just touched on it, but I'd be curious if you could expand on some of the primary challenges you faced in the process.
Well, the biggest thing really was the fact that we were dealing with a reaction that was air sensitive, right? For most of the things that we do with LCMS in particular, you're normally preparing your sample in air and doing all these manipulations in air. But then now that we're dealing with organometallic complexes that in many respects can be air sensitive, we actually that really kind of became the biggest challenge is how were we going to start to prepare samples and manipulate them in such a way that we would minimize any changes to what was happening in solution in the actual reaction.
That makes sense. I was hoping you could touch on the sample preparation steps required and talk about why some of those steps are critical to ensure the right results.
So in the beginning, we actually got rather lucky that the complex we were looking at was very air stable. So for those, it was simply taking an aliquot of our reaction and doing very similar things to what you would do for like standard HPLC analysis. Take the aliquot from the reaction, dilute it down, usually with something like acetonitrile, but normally a solvent that would be friendly with the mass spec. But once we started to venture into looking at other palladium catalyzed reactions from like the canonical literature, that is where we actually started to look into other aspects of how we were going to have to prepare these samples. And what we realized the hard way was that keeping oxygen out of a lot of these systems was very necessary, just because a lot of phosphine ligands are very easily oxidized with just oxygen in the air. And that can lead to other structural changes in what you might see on the mass spec. So it really came in to figure out ways to introduce our samples air free, being able to use any degas solvents and dried solvents. And specifically, what ended up happening afterwards was having to figure out a way to filter our solvents without introducing too much air into the system. Because, as anyone who's really dealt with any amount of mass spec in general, I kind of know that having a lot of solids or stuff that can easily become insoluble is a problem, just because now you can start to damage a lot of the components in the mass spec. So being able to do these filtrations air free and a lot of our manipulations air free kind of became the next step of what we were trying to figure out.
And if I heard you correctly, I believe you said that you're focusing more on dilution rather than concentration for
Yeah.
sample prep. One interesting thing I've seen, just for background, my company makes evaporation equipment used for sample concentration. And because we're utilizing nitrogen, one thing I've seen where people need that inert atmosphere rather than doing the reaction in a glove box and
Mm-hmm.
then transferring it to the evaporator, they do the reaction and the drying down under nitrogen,
Mm-hmm.
which is a great solution for preventing that oxidation. But obviously, when you need to dilute the sample rather than concentrate it,
Yeah.
it's not a good solution for what you're doing.
Well, especially with us, so we didn't have our lab didn't have a glove box, so we weren't even doing the initial manipulations. Like the actual reaction setup was all done on the bench top, and then the vessels usually purged out with nitrogen. So that was kind of the bigger issue there was the fact that we weren't even dealing inside of a glove box. The glove box would have probably made things a lot more straightforward because everything's already under an atmosphere. But the fact that we weren't kind of provided these extra challenges for us. But I think at the end of the day, though, I think it better helped informed us to basically try to make this method as friendly as possible, right? Because I mean, just like our lab didn't have immediate access to a glove box or easy access to a glove box, a lot of labs out there might be in a very similar situation to what we might be in. Or just the fact that it would be easier to manipulate everything on the bench top rather than having to go through a glove box for everything.